Welcome to EPG Pachala. This is philosophy. I am Dr. Venu Sattini from the Department of Philosophy, University of Hyderabad. The name of the module on which I'll be talking today is Philosophy of Science and Introduction, and the module is written by Dr. S.K. Arun. What we would like to do today is first give a general background picture and then of philosophy of science, and then go on to explore or try to understand what philosophy of science is. So for that, we will try to understand what is philosophy and then what is science, taking these two questions separately, and then what is the link, what is the relation between the philosophy and science. So we'll begin with philosophy. What is general understanding of philosophy? Philosophy asked, traditionally and generally, very fundamental questions such as what is ultimate reality, or what is knowledge, or what is truth, and then if I claim to know certain things, what are the rational principles on the basis of which I can validate my claim. In other words, philosophy basically, or so-called core philosophy, basically deals with metaphysics, question of reality, epistemology, questions of knowledge, and logic, questions of rational principles and values by which you establish your claim. Now, but human curiosity is unlimited. We just want to make sense of the world or the nature that has been given to us. So we make inquiries into different domains such as botany or even mathematics, or we want to understand our society or mind itself. And then these things are intricately related to, again, philosophical questions, because then we go on to ask what are the fundamental presuppositions or the fundamental issues on which these truth claims or knowledge claim stands. So there is a link between philosophy and all these special inquiries that give rise to important philosophies such as philosophy of science, and then the philosophy of mind, even philosophy of language, philosophy of law, philosophy of mathematics, and so on. So here we can understand that philosophy of science is one of the subdomains of philosophy. So strictly speaking, philosophy of science does not come under science per se. It's not coming under natural sciences, but under philosophy. But when we want to approach this study, like philosophy of science, we have to enter from a certain philosophical perspective, because there are so many ways and methods of doing philosophy. So how are we going to approach, or what are the philosophical approach, what is the philosophical approach by which we want to understand the philosophy of science? In this module, basically we will be looking at philosophy of science from analytic perspective. That is, we want to clarify basic concepts which go on to define a system of science. Concepts such as, let us say, law or explanation. What constitutes scientific explanation? Or if you say that something is a theory of this and that, what do you mean by theory? What makes it scientific? What is the methodology involved in it? So we are looking at those basic concepts and then clarifying those concepts. So this approach is called analytical approach. So what are these basic principles of analytic philosophy by which we want to look at this philosophy of science? One, as I said, analytical approach is basically one of clarifying concepts. So we will try to clarify those basic or so-called important concepts which go on to explain scientific activity. The second one is that it is very general in nature. That means philosophy is very general in nature, in that it is not limited by culture or region or specific linguistic community as such. No, it is not. By being generic, it is something like even universal. the sense that we are making of certain words cut across culture and time. So it is very generic in nature. The third is that philosophy also deals with, as I mentioned before, reasoning or argument. If you claim to know certain things, let us say about plant or about anything, animals, then that claim needs to be justified. So in other words, in philosophy, you may make any claim, but no claim is accepted as legitimate unless you justify those claims, and those justification has to be logical or let us say objective or even rational. So philosophy in this sense deal with basic reasoning or logical processes for justifying certain claims. Philosophy is also interested in looking at the basic presuppositions or assumptions or even foundations upon which certain other knowledge claim is made. So we are not just trying to understand what is given to us, but on the basis of what somebody has made this kind of claim. So we will be looking, basically philosophy looks into those kind of predispositions or presumptions or assumptions or foundational questions. Now that is philosophy. Now we will try to understand what is science. Here, without really trying to explain in detail, let us take one real account that has happened in the United States, which has to do with a court case. So there is a group of people who are from a religious background, Christian religious background, saying that creation science, creation account of the world can be also given a legitimacy as science. So they have said that therefore creation science should be taught in schools, just like evolutionary science. So we know that Darwinism or evolutionism is a philosophy and creationism is a philosophy, but evolutionary science is not. So also they want to say that even creation science is a science. So in the first place, court decided in their favor, but this decision of the court has been challenged by a lot of other organizations like National Association of Biology Teachers and Arkansas. It happened in the state of Arkansas. So Arkansas Educational Association and a lot of other organizations to do with the protection of religious liberty and public education, they came forward and then challenged the decision of the court. Finally, the court decided in their favor, in the sense that they have dropped this creation science as a science, but on the basis of certain guiding principle. So we may look at some of these characteristics or defining features of science. The decision of the court is based on these points. One, that if something is a science, it must be guided by a natural law. The word to watch out is natural. It must be guided by a natural law. And if it makes any kind of explanatory claim or predictory claim, then it must be done with special reference to those laws of nature. And it has to be testable. That means empirically testable. If I make a certain claim, there should be a way to verify, to test the truth claim. The next one is that its conclusion. Whatever conclusion you are making, that means whatever truth claim you are making about your science should be tentative. That means it shouldn't be final. Here is the catch word, because if creation science is taken as a science, then whatever truth claim that you are making is not revisable, because it has its sanction from certain religious doctrines, religious dogma, and that religious text or religious truth is not revisable. In this and this point is very important, because scientific truth or claim of scientific knowledge is always tentative. But if creation science claims to be a science, then the truth which goes on to consider the foundation of this creation science is not revisable, or it is not changeable. Yeah. The next one is it should be falsifiable. In other words, there must be a way to test it, and not only that, it should give us a principle of falsifiability. That means it should give us a test criteria. Our claim, our truth will be falsified if this and this experiment has been done. But creation science, as we know, has not been successful in coming up with those falsifiability criteria. So on the basis of these 5 points, the court decision has been made. And this is very important because these points give us a general outline of how we should understand what science is. Now, can we really meaningfully talk about aim of science? Because aim normally suggests intention, something to do with human or rational agency. We talk about what is your aim, but science as an abstract system, it is not a self-conscious kind of thing which can say, oh, I have this aim. No. So are we asking a wrong question? What is the aim of science? Perhaps some will say, no, it is not science per se, but we may want to say aim of scientific practitioners. I mean, scientists. What is the aim of those scientists? Even here, different scientists will have different aims. That means different reasons for doing science. Some of them probably are doing science because science gives better job opportunities. Maybe they are not interested in complicated issues of human life or human experience, but science being objective, so they want to do it in the name of objectivity. Or there may be a different reason, different aims for doing science, but these are not all legitimate reasons. But when we say aim of science, we are looking for certain important features, which we may even call it intrinsic features or values that go on to constitute science itself. So we make a distinction between intrinsic aims and non-intrinsic or extrinsic aims of science. So let us say epistemic values of science can be considered extrinsic aim. What are those epistemic values? Like simplicity. To be science, it must be simple. Sometimes we make even this kind of claim. It must be coherent, or it must be complete, or there must be a unity. There are certain other things like elegance or beauty and things like that. But these are not intrinsic to doing science. These are extra features of doing science. So when we say aim of science, basically we want to understand what are those basic constitutions, or what are those things which go on to constitute the practice of science itself. So we have some points such as knowledge. That we do science for the sake of knowledge. We do science because through science we want to explain and we want to understand the world. So explanation and understanding are some of the intrinsic feature of science itself. And that another thing is that when we say it is science, it must be testable. So testability, truth. We cannot do science minus truth. It is intrinsically tied up with truth. So truth is still the constitutive feature of science. And another important feature is that it is prediction. Maybe any human science, even our myths, social accounts, or civilization narratives also explain the world and the event or the phenomena. But many of these do not constitute science because they lack predictive power. But science essentially deals with prediction. If this is true, then I can make prediction about the future, things like that. So prediction is also an intrinsic or internal constitution of science. And another point is fruitfulness. In other words, it should not go on round and round, having so many confusion and debates and contestation. But once we agree on certain things, it should give result, productivity, or let us say fruitfulness. So these are the things which constitute the aim of science itself. The next question we can think about is, how is there any distinctive way of doing science or making certain scientific claim? Because when we look up, we see that philosophy is also interested in knowledge. Every other discipline is also interested in knowledge. In fact, philosophy in the first place started raising questions because it wants to know the truth. So in which case science, philosophy is as much interested in truth and knowledge as science is. So these are not the basic criteria on the basis of which we distinguish science from non-sciences. Then there are certain important issues like that. We will see some more later on, but to begin with, we want to know the origin of the word, let us say the root word of the word science. It comes from the Latin word scientia or scientia, which means general knowledge, knowledge in general. But even before that, before Latin became a so-called official language of Europe, science was there even during the time of ancient Greek, like Aristotle. He defines what we so-called knowledge pursuit as episteme. From here we derive the word epistemic. So episteme for Aristotle is not just general knowledge or knowledge in general, but knowledge which can be given demonstration. So demonstration here is the catchword, because not every knowledge claim, not every truth claim can be given a demonstration. Demonstration has to do with something called certainty or absolute. So when I have a mathematical claim, I can give a demonstration, step-by-step proof. Or when I am making any truth claim or knowledge claim, then Aristotle here introduces something called syllogism, a form of argument by which the truth of the conclusion can be given demonstration. That is, by application of certain logical principle, you demonstrate necessarily the truth of the conclusion from the premises. So when he talks about episteme, he is looking for absolute truth claims, means truth which are certain and which are not, let us say, which cannot be even challenged. So by episteme, Aristotle means this kind of demonstrative knowledge, not just any knowledge claim or general knowledge. So then how are we to understand the present practice of science against the background of this Aristotelian view, or they say the science as scientia in the scholastic time? The difference is that of practice. During Aristotelian time, it is very difficult to demarcate science from so-called philosophy, and even during the medieval time, there is no such word as science as of now, but even science is known as natural philosophy. So it's very difficult to demarcate, but something happened in the medieval time, that is one particular philosopher, Francis Bacon. He came up with a criteria that to be scientific is to have a method, and the method is one of induction. What do we mean by this method of induction? It means any scientific claim should be grounded in experiment. It should be practical and not just speculative claims which cannot be verified. So he brought experiment as the foundation of science, and here is important demarcation between the science and so-called philosophy, because in the ancient time, let us say Aristotle, he can't really make this distinction between science and philosophy. A reflection of scientific practice itself go on to make philosophy. So there is no real demarcation, but because of what Bacon says, we can now make a crucial distinction, or say a partial distinction even, between science and philosophy. But even during the time of Bacon, Francis Bacon, there are so many basic philosophical assumptions involved in understanding or even doing science. So we will later on explore a little more how this Baconian method or way of looking at the science has been revised by, let us say, empiricism or logical positivism. We have to still make further shift of science from philosophy. And how are we going to do about it? How are we going to disentangle science from philosophy? It is by looking at the very nature of generalized statement. Philosophy also makes generalized claim, and also science makes generalized claim. How is one generalized claim or general statement differs from each other? Well, let us say, as far as science goes, the generalized statement, the general statement is grounded in observation. So that means by observation of particular instances, you go on to describe those observations, and finally you come up with a generalized statement. For example, when we are looking at let us say the movement of the wind constantly, that is observation. When we look at the nature of, let us say, plants growth, it is also some kind of observation. You have direct experience, or you have direct intervention with the subject of investigation. So this is called observation. So the way in which you arrive at the universal statement or so-called general statement is from observation. It is from observation of case 1, 2, 3 that you arrive at general or universal statement. But that may not be the case in let us say philosophy. So this is how we understand laws or theories in science from other universal statement of philosophy. But again, there are certain important questions. For example, let us consider Newton's mechanics, law of gravity or motion, whatever. These are not just the result of observation. Obviously, Newton is limited. He cannot do n number of experiments or let us say observation to come up with those kind of generalized statement. So certain abstraction is required. At the end of the day, then it appears as though that the law is not even about the world of observation or the world of experience that we have. It is stating something very different from the world of experience. It is so mathematically precise that it seems to be claiming about some ideal world and not about this world of experience or world of observation. So but in any case, what is happening here is a series of generalization and series of abstraction is required to arrive at scientific laws. So that is different. Now there are some philosophers who try to understand the link between philosophy and science in the form of a metaphor or some example, that and that is a chain. Suppose we have a chain. A chain will have a beginning and an end point. Now we begin with one end, which is observation, that is commonsensical world, and then science is an attempt to move from observation towards the other extreme end, and the extreme end of the chain is philosophy. So it is the science which is providing the continual thread between what is commonsensical world and the philosophical world. But one may even question whether this example or a metaphor of chain to explain the link between science and philosophy is acceptable. But there is one way we can look at the relation between science and philosophy, in that science deals with direct experience, the commonsensical world, and it tries to generalizes, systematizes, and arrive at a certain abstraction. And when we arrive at that abstraction, philosophy picks up. And what are the basic concepts, what are basic principles on the basis of which we are making this generalization? So the basic principles and concepts are undertaken by philosophy. So that way there is still a link between scientific practice and philosophical practice. We move on from the relation between philosophy and science to the scope of science. As suggested earlier, philosophy of science is not science. It is philosophy. What makes it philosophy is because philosophy of science is a second order inquiry. While trying to explain the relation between science and philosophy, I was saying that philosophy picks up or picks out certain important concepts of science and then discusses those concepts. So in other words, philosophy of science makes no attempt to make discoveries in the world. Rather, they try to question the basic assumption of science. In that sense, it is second order inquiry. In this sense, it is philosophy and not something which needs to be done in a say, scientific lab or go into the field and then do certain kind of observation. So the scope or the nature of philosophy of science is very different from scientific practice per se. So here, philosophy of science is about something. So the aboutness defines philosophy of science. In other words, we are not directly engaging in scientific practice. We are not directly investigating the truth of certain observation or nature or phenomena. So what are those questions of philosophy of science that we are interested in? For example, we said it is to do with clarifying of concept, but it should also deal with some fundamental or basic questions. And some of these questions are like these: what is the nature of scientific inquiry, such that it is so different from other kinds of inquiries? Or is there a specific method of doing science? For pursuit of every kind of knowledge, there seems to be a kind of method. But when we say it is scientific, it is claiming certain distinctiveness. And so, is it because of the method? If there is a method, what is the method of doing science? So we are asking for the methodology, the nature and scope of those methods in doing scientific practice. When we say science explain, for example, what are the principles or the condition that must be satisfied in order to accept something as scientific explanation? We are looking for those conditions to accept certain scientific explanation. Or when we say there are two competing theories, each claiming to explain or predict certain thing, claim, let us say, of physics, how are we going to accept one theory as opposed to another theory? What are the principles that we must accept or recognize one theory as legitimate and the other as false theory? So these are questions that we ask in philosophy of science. Like I've been repeating, but how are we to understand scientific law? In mathematics, there are mathematical theorems and mathematical laws. We have a constitution, which is a set of laws. We have even laws in social sciences. How are we to distinguish scientific laws from this kind of laws in other sciences, in other domain of studies? So these are questions which are raised in philosophy of science, and which philosophers of science tries to grapple. We have seen that science has grown from Aristotle to Francis Bacon, and the kind of questions raised on sciences are also growing. In the contemporary time, let us say in the modern time, the discipline has the distinction or demarcation of science and philosophy has become more explicit, and this is so because of a group of people called logical empiricists. So they struggled very hard to bring about this distinction. The point is that for them, philosophy is not very productive. Philosophy in the sense of metaphysics, claiming certain things which cannot in principle be verified to be true or false. Therefore, they don't contribute anything to the body of knowledge. It may serve other purposes, but as far as our desire to know this world, metaphysical questions and answers that way do not really contribute to the body of knowledge. So they want to eliminate metaphysics of philosophy from science. So they bring in criteria to distinguish, and the principle is one of verifiability. So there are subsequent development. I mean, logical empiricism or let us say logical positivism has undergone the certain processes of modifications, revision as such, but the basic criteria remains the same. It is verifiability, and verifiability presupposes that there is a world and that on the basis of certain facts we can verify certain truth claim. So verifiability, experience is the catchword of logical positivism. Now, this positivist movement started in Vienna, and they have identified themselves as Vienna Circle. Here is a group of philosophers and scientists, mostly scientists with philosophical interest. They form a group and then try to bring this distinction. So some of the important members of this Vienna Circle are Moritz Schlick and Otto Neurath, and other important persons are also Carnap, Rudolf Carnap, and Gödel, the person who is associated with the given incompleteness, proof of incompleteness theorem, and others like Philipp Frank and Herbert Feigl are also associated with it. No, Vienna Circle is not the only one that is happening. There are other philosophers and scientists who are also equally interested in a similar movement in Germany. So they help one another in exchanging information and things like that to bring about this movement. But what these people are really trying to do is to take the empiricist approach, experimental approach to doing science, and eliminate all kind of speculative concepts or speculative principles from the practice of science altogether. So they want to limit science to observation or experiment. So for them, how are we going to do it? So then for that they want to inquire into the very nature of language. This is important. They will pick up certain sentences and see whether this particular sentence, this proposition describes the world of experience, the world of facts, or is it making some claim about something else. So their approach is not directly investigating the world, but analyzing sentences. So for that way, they make in that regard, they make a distinction between what is so-called analytic propositions and empirical propositions, or sometimes observational languages or observational statement, as opposed to theoretical or speculative observations. Here, when we say something as analytic, in other words, analytic proposition, it has much to do with logic and mathematics. That in this kind of systems, the truth doesn't depend on our observation. That means we cannot use our experience to justify the truth claim of analytic statement. For example, a mathematical statement like 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. We don't need experience, addition of two things to show that, oh yes, this equation is true. No, by the very nature of mathematical language, we know that this is true. So they have accepted this kind of analytic truths, and this is important because they don't want to discard mathematics from science. And the other kind of statement which they accept is, of course, observational statement, also sometimes called synthetic in nature. That means a statement which should give new information, whereas analytic statement, they don't make any claim about the world, so they don't provide new information. But when you are doing scientific investigation, it should give us something new about the world. So what is that thing which gives us some new addition? That is experience. So they are that way dealing with observational statements, something like claim about space-time itself, which are very difficult, whether time is real or not. So they don't want to deal with this kind of things. Rather, they want to do with something called analytic truth and something called observational statements or empirical statements. So that way, their basic method is so-called induction or confirmation or verification. These are all cousins in the sense they are very importantly related to one another, because on the principle of verification we can confirm certain theoretical claim, and the method which is used to make this kind of confirmation and verification is called induction. So these are rooted in some kind of experience ultimately. So logical positivism is also sometimes understood or known as logical empiricist. The important issues and questions involving this way of looking at the philosophy of science, the details of which will be taken up in the next module. But for now, let us try to give a brief characterization of what philosophy of science is from this perspective of analytics, or in the eye of logical empiricists, which brought about a radical demarcation of science from, let us say, philosophy. So some of the principles are something like question dealing with reductionism, question dealing with essentialism, the nature of certain concepts in science, which we have seen before. They are interested in all these kind of things. Whether science is to be construed in terms of certain laws or concepts which are not given to us in experience. And using those concepts, we should explain the world of observable. So that is raising the question of realism and anti-realism. We will be looking at some of these important questions. What constitutes the nature of scientific laws or scientific practice? Is it one of realism? Is it one of anti-realism? So we will be looking at these questions in philosophy of science. There are different philosophers of science, such as Thomas Kuhn, who says that scientific practice is limited to a community, and that we will try to solve puzzle within a paradigm. And there are others who says there is no scientific method at all. There is no privileged scientific method as distinct from other sciences or other human pursuits. So they will try to even do away with the question of science. Such people are called fadabund. And there are others like Karl Popper, who says the way to do science is one of falsificationism. So the philosophers are not really interested in the finding distinction between philosophy and science, but how to demarcate science from non-sciences or pseudosciences, things which claim to be science but not really science. So he comes up with the idea of falsifiability, saying that the method of science is one of falsification, and it is this which distinguishes science from other kind of pseudosciences. Looks like science involve the method of science like induction, but not really science at all. So these are some of the questions which we will take it up later. And of course today there are many entry points into doing philosophy of science. We have just tried to understand from analytical perspective, one perspective of looking at the philosophy of science, but there are other entry points like feminism. There are continental philosophy of science. They are also trying to look at philosophy from different angles. So in the coming modules, we will be looking at these different approaches of doing philosophy of science. With this, we have come to the conclusion of this module. So let us have a quick recap or review of what we have done. We tried to understand what is philosophy and what is science, what is the relation between the philosophy and science, and ultimately what are the reasons that finally demarcated philosophy and science, I mean science from philosophy, and what is this philosophy of science. You see, this looking for reasons or factors that demarcate science from philosophy, and at the same time trying to provide a link between science and philosophy. So this is philosophy of science, and by looking at a certain approach of philosophy of science, basically here we have taken up logical empiricist only. This is how they want to do philosophy of science. Basically that means providing logical model or logical framework, clarifying certain scientific concepts in order to understand scientific laws and scientific claim. So this is the approach that basically we try to provide in this module. Thank you.